Black man saves little boy from kidnappers. Then a black SUV shows up at his house. Caleb thought he was doing the right thing, but now the lines between hero and pawn are impossibly blurred. Who's playing the game and who's being played? The truth is slipping further out of reach, and Caleb doesn't know who he's really fighting for. Watch till the end. Please subscribe, like, engage in the comments and share. Let me tell you Caleb's story. It was a quiet afternoon in the suburban neighborhood, the kind of peaceful day where the streets hummed with the sounds of lawnmowers and kids laughing in the distance. Caleb, a strong but kind-hearted 28-year-old mechanic, walked home from work, his boots thudding softly against the pavement. He had just fixed a rusty car for Mrs. Jenkins, and now he was headed home, looking forward to a quiet evening. But then he heard it. A sudden noise, something out of place, coming from an alley up ahead. It wasn't just the usual sounds of traffic or the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Curious and concerned, Caleb slowed his pace. As he rounded the corner of the alley, his heart skipped a beat. Two men, big and rough-looking, were trying to drag a small boy into a black van parked at the alley's entrance. The boy, no older than 7 or 8, was fighting them, his legs kicking, his hands trying to grab onto anything for leverage. Caleb's first instinct was fear. This wasn't his fight, was it? He could feel his pulse racing, his hands tightening into fists. But there was no time to think. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, his voice firm but shaky. The kidnappers turned in surprise, and before they could react, Caleb rushed forward, slamming into one of them with all his strength. The man stumbled back, hitting the wall with a grunt. Caleb quickly grabbed the other by the shoulder, shoving him away. Both men glared at him, anger flashing in their eyes. But Caleb was already pulling the boy close, his arms protectively wrapping around him. "You're safe now," Caleb whispered, his voice soft, though his heart was still racing. The boy clung to him, trembling. "Don't worry," Caleb promised, his eyes filled with determination. "I won't let anyone hurt you." The next day, Caleb's small house felt unusually quiet. He was out front, working on an old sedan, its rusted frame lying open under his hands. The neighborhood was calm as always, the kind of peace that made it easy to forget how quickly danger could creep in. But something didn't feel right. Caleb couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach after yesterday's incident with the kidnappers. He wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced up at the street. Everything looked normal, but the air felt thick, like something was about to happen. Then, as if on cue, there was a soft knock at the door. Caleb wiped his forehead and stood up, expecting it to be one of his neighbors. When he opened the door, though, it wasn't who he expected. Standing on the porch was Sarah, Danny's mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Caleb immediately stepped aside, letting her in. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to speak through the tears. "You saved my boy. I can never thank you enough." She shook her head, choking back another sob. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Caleb. You saved him from a gang. They were going to take him, use him." Her voice trembled. "They're involved in human trafficking. Danny was just a pawn." Caleb felt his stomach churn. He hadn't thought much about why the men were after Danny, but hearing Sarah's words now, it made him sick. He nodded quietly, trying to comfort her with a few words, but something in her tone didn't sit right. She gave him a long, searching look, her eyes darting to the street outside. "I'll keep him close. He won't be alone again." But Caleb didn't feel reassured. There was something about the way Sarah was speaking, something guarded, that made him uneasy. Had she known more than she was telling him? Why hadn't she seemed more scared? That night, as Caleb sat at home, unable to shake the tension from the day, the quiet of the house was broken by a loud knock. His heart jumped. No one ever knocked at this hour. Through the peephole, he saw a tall man in a dark suit standing at the door. Caleb's gut twisted. Who was this? He opened the door cautiously. The man introduced himself as Agent Carter, a government official. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, like someone used to dealing with dangerous situations. "We've been tracking that gang for some time," Carter explained. "Your bravery has given us a critical lead on their operations, but you should know, now that you've interfered, they might come after you." Before Caleb could respond, the man gave him a tight smile and turned to leave. As the door closed, Caleb's eyes instinctively went to the street. Across the road, a black SUV was parked, its headlights glaring through the darkening evening. The vehicle didn't move. Someone was watching him. A chill ran down Caleb's spine. He locked the door quickly, his thoughts racing. Why was the SUV still there? And who had been sitting in it? He felt a tightening in his chest, something dark and dangerous lurking just beyond his front door. The next morning, Caleb's gut churned as soon as he stepped outside. The black SUV was still parked across the street, its engine off, the tinted windows hiding whoever, or whatever, was inside. It was always there, always watching. And no one ever got out. Not once. Caleb tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just paranoia. He had things to do. Wrench in hand, he got to work on a stubborn engine, but the weight of the SUV's presence hung over him like a cloud. No matter how hard he tried to focus, his eyes would keep drifting to the street. His mind kept circling back to that eerie black vehicle. As the day wore on, it only got worse. Caleb's nerves were fraying. His every movement felt like it was being watched, the air thick with suspicion. Then, just as the sun started to set, Caleb's phone rang. It was Sarah. "Caleb, it's Danny. He's gone." Her voice cracked, and he could hear her sobbing, the panic in her voice unmistakable. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask the details. He was already pulling his jacket on, adrenaline kicking in. He could feel the urgency in Sarah's voice, could sense the gravity of the situation. When he arrived at Sarah's house, his worst fears were confirmed. The front door was wide open, the air heavy with silence. Inside, everything seemed normal, except for the empty, dark hallway. No signs of a struggle, no broken windows, just an empty house. "Danny," Caleb called, his voice rising in panic. But there was no answer. As he started to turn over furniture and search through rooms, he heard it. The sound of an engine. The unmistakable growl of the black SUV's motor, its presence a haunting reminder of the danger that had been lurking just outside. Caleb froze in place. The SUV was moving, slowly, deliberately, up the street, and it was heading straight for his house. Why was it coming this way? His chest tightened with dread. The SUV stopped right in front of Caleb's house. The engine cut off, and the passenger door opened. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as Sarah stepped out. But this wasn't the same woman he had met the day before. There was no tear-streaked face, no desperation in her eyes. Instead, she looked calm, detached. Her steps were deliberate as she walked over to Caleb, her gaze cold, almost robotic. "You shouldn't have gotten involved, Caleb," she said, her voice steady, too steady. "You don't know what you've done." Caleb felt his blood run cold. The ground beneath him felt like it was slipping away. What was going on? Before he could react, Agent Carter emerged from the SUV, his cold eyes locking onto Caleb's. He wore the same dark suit from the night before, his expression unnervingly calm. "We tried to warn you," Carter said, his voice smooth but sinister. "You were never supposed to save him." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. His mind raced to process what he was hearing, but the world seemed to crumble around him. Sarah had been lying. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't scared. She was part of this, all along. Danny, the boy he thought he was saving, had never been in danger. It was all a trap. The realization hit Caleb with a sickening thud. He had been used. Caleb's breath came in sharp gasps as his thoughts raced. He needed to fight back, But everything about this situation was wrong. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded by lies. There was no way he could take on a gang this powerful on his own. And now, he realized, his only real option was to run, to escape. But every instinct in him screamed to fight. As Caleb turned to make a break for the back door, a voice cut through the tension, stopping him dead in his tracks. Caleb. He spun around. It was Danny. The boy was standing in the doorway, the faint light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across his small frame. But there was something about him that felt off. The innocence Caleb had seen in Danny's eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look. In his hand, Danny held a small blinking device. It was flashing red, its bright light cutting through the darkness like a warning. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. His first thought was that it was a bomb, something meant to finish him off after everything he'd done. But then Danny's lips curled into a smile. Too perfect, too cold. "It's too late, Caleb," Danny said, his voice calm, almost bored. "You should have stayed out of it." Caleb froze, his breath caught in his chest. This was the moment he'd been dreading. Danny had been playing him all along. The boy wasn't innocent. He was part of it. Every tear, every cry for help had been nothing more than an act. A sick realization settled over Caleb. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the child he thought he was protecting. Danny had led him right into this trap. The device in Danny's hand continued to blink, and Caleb's mind raced. He knew he had to act fast. But what was it? A bomb. A tracker. The tension in the air was thick with the threat of something terrible, something looming. Suddenly, a thought flashed in Caleb's mind. The device wasn't ticking like a bomb, but it was counting down, slowly, methodically, as if it was measuring time. A timer. In that instant, Caleb moved. With everything he had, he lunged forward, grabbing Danny by the arm, yanking the boy back into the house as he tore the device out of his hand. He slammed it down on the counter, eyes locked on the timer, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The numbers were flashing. Seconds. Caleb didn't waste a moment. He grabbed the nearest tool he could find, a wrench, and pried open the back of the device. His hand shook, the seconds ticking away like an endless countdown, but he managed to disarm it just in time. The light went out. The room fell silent. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at the now useless device. His chest heaved with relief, but it was short-lived. A low hum filled the air, then the sound of an engine starting outside. He rushed to the window, looking out. The black SUV was pulling away from the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The windows were tinted, but he could still see Agent Carter in the driver's seat, Sarah sitting next to him, her face blank, expressionless. They were leaving him behind. The car turned the corner and disappeared into the night. Caleb's stomach twisted. He hadn't been able to stop them. He hadn't stopped any of it. They were gone. His legs felt weak as he collapsed into a chair, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. It was all so much worse than he had imagined. The game had never been about saving anyone. It had been about drawing him in, getting him to play the role of the hero, only to use him as bait. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest as the truth hit him. This was far from over. Caleb had never felt more alone. The cold, damp air of the abandoned warehouse seemed to seep into his bones, chilling him from the inside out. His footsteps echoed through the vast, empty space as he moved carefully between the shadows, every instinct screaming at him to keep moving, to keep hidden. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the weight of everything he had learned in the past few days. He had tracked Sarah and the gang to this place, the heart of their operations, and now it was time to confront them. But he wasn't sure what he was walking into. The last few weeks had been a blur of confusion, guilt, and betrayal. Caleb had spent sleepless nights piecing together the horrifying truth about the trafficking ring he had uncovered. The people who had betrayed him, Sarah, Danny, even Agent Carter, had played their parts to perfection. He had thought he was helping a helpless mother and saving an innocent child. Instead, he had walked right into their trap. Sarah wasn't a victim. She was one of them. And Danny had been a pawn in their game from the beginning. As Caleb crept deeper into the warehouse, the sound of dripping water echoed off the concrete walls, the air thick with dust and decay. His footsteps were muffled by the damp, but his heart beat loudly in his chest, each thump a reminder of the anger and frustration building inside him. How had it come to this? How had he let himself be used like this? His thoughts kept returning to Danny's face, the cold smile the boy had given him when he had revealed the truth. Caleb had saved him, and the whole time, Danny had been playing him. The betrayal felt like a weight on his chest, suffocating him with guilt. He had failed to see the truth, failed to see the boy for what he truly was, just another cog in the machine. His thoughts were interrupted by voices drifting through the dark hallway. Caleb's ears perked up. He recognized Sarah's voice, low and cold, speaking to someone else. It was unmistakable, Agent Carter. Caleb's gut twisted at the sound of his name. He had thought Carter was on his side, a government agent working to bring down the gang. But now he understood. Carter was no different from Sarah. They were all part of the same twisted operation. They had used him, manipulated him into playing the role of the hero, only to turn him into a pawn in their greater plan. Caleb crouched behind a stack of crates, trying to remain silent, his breath shallow as he listened. Through the crack in the metal door, he could hear the conversation clearly. Caleb's interference has delayed the operation. Sarah was saying, her voice clipped and sharp. It's time to take care of him, once and for all. Caleb's stomach churned. He had hoped, even as he had tracked them to this place, that maybe, just maybe, there was some shred of goodness left in Sarah. But hearing her speak like this, hearing her so cold and detached, he knew there was nothing left for him to save. She had made her choice. The door creaked slightly as Caleb shifted, his hands clammy with sweat. He had to act fast. He had to stop them, or Danny's fate, and possibly his own, would be sealed forever. His mind raced, but there was no time for hesitation. With a burst of adrenaline, Caleb charged at the door, slamming his shoulder into it. The metal door flew open, crashing against the wall with a deafening bang. The moment Sarah and Carter saw him, everything exploded into chaos. Gunshots rang out, the sharp crack of the gunfire echoing through the warehouse. Caleb dove behind a stack of crates just as a bullet whizzed past his ear, the sharp sound of it cutting through the air. His heart pounded as he scrambled for cover, the pressure of the situation closing in on him from every side. He didn't know how many people were in the warehouse, but he knew that Sarah and Carter weren't the only ones. There had to be more men working for the gang, waiting to jump in. His mechanic instincts kicked in, and he scanned the room quickly, looking for anything he could use. The warehouse was filled with tools, parts, and old equipment. Caleb's mind raced as he picked up a metal pipe, then a few loose screws. He quickly rigged up a makeshift weapon. Anything he could use to fight back. The gunfire continued, but Caleb didn't flinch. He had come too far to back down now. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity, his mind moving faster than his body. He could hear Sarah's voice, cold and commanding as she spoke to Carter, trying to coordinate their shots. They were taking turns, working together to flush him out. Caleb knew he couldn't stay hidden for long, but he wasn't going to run this time. He had come here to save Danny, and he wasn't leaving without him. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from above. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as debris rained down on him. The sound of a body hitting the floor echoed in the silence that followed. He looked up in shock, and there, standing in the center of the room, was Danny. The boy Caleb had thought was innocent, the one he had tried to save, now stood in front of him, cold and calculating. Danny's expression was devoid of emotion. He didn't look like a scared child. He looked like a soldier. In his hands, he held a gun, the cold barrel pointing directly at Sarah. "Step back," Danny ordered, his voice smooth, steady. "You've failed." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Danny, the boy he had risked everything for, was a part of this all along. His mind raced as Danny stepped forward, the gun still aimed at Sarah. "I never wanted to be saved," Danny continued, his eyes cold and distant. "I was part of the plan from the start. You were just a pawn, Caleb. You thought you were the hero, but in the end, I was the one controlling the game." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. His knees went weak as he processed the betrayal, but before he could respond, another voice rang out. It was Agent Carter, stepping out from the shadows, a slow, deliberate clap echoing in the quiet room. "Well done, Caleb," Carter said, his smile twisted and smug. "You've been playing your part perfectly." He stepped forward, the shadows seeming to swallow him as he moved. "You're not just a mechanic, Caleb. You're a hero for hire. And we knew you would help us if we pushed the right buttons." Caleb's world shattered. Carter, Agent Carter, had been working with Danny all along. The so-called government agent was a mastermind in disguise, playing his own game while Caleb believed he was working to stop them. Carter had led Caleb right into their trap, kept him on track just long enough to expose his skills, to see if he would make a good addition to their operation. Caleb's hands shook with rage. He had been used, manipulated, just to fuel their sick game. In that moment, everything seemed to collapse in on him. The walls of the warehouse closed in, the noise from the gunfire and explosions ringing in his ears. Caleb was drowning in betrayal, the weight of it almost unbearable. But then, something inside him snapped. He couldn't let it end like this. With a swift motion, Caleb grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it with all his strength, knocking over a stack of equipment. The resulting crash triggered a chain reaction, sending sparks flying and knocking out their communication equipment. The explosion rattled the building, the force of it sending everyone off balance. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed Danny, pulling him out of the wreckage and making a break for the exit. But as they reached the door, Caleb faced a choice: escape or confront the boy who had destroyed everything. He shoved Danny to the ground, his heart racing. There was no more time for hesitation. Caleb turned and bolted out of the building just as sirens wailed in the distance. The sounds of approaching police cars grew louder, but Caleb knew the fight wasn't over. The gang's operations had been exposed, but there were still people out there, people who wouldn't rest until they finished what they started. As Caleb walked away, the flames from the explosion flickering behind him, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. The battle was over, but the scars would remain. The shadow of the black SUV would never leave him, and he would never forget the lesson he had learned, that not all heroes win, and not all villains are obvious. Sometimes, the world is darker and more twisted than anyone could ever imagine. How careful can one be? Is there any forewarning for signs of being trapped as a pawn? Share your thoughts. Please subscribe, like and share. Thanks for watching.